He was a lonely widower until he fell for the hotel waitress. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The main ballroom of the Beaumont Plaza Hotel in Manhattan glowed under the crystal chandeliers, filled with the hum of polite conversation, soft laughter, and the clinking of champagne glasses. It was the closing night of an international medical conference, bringing together renowned specialists, health investors, and reporters eager for headline material. Between busy waiters and impeccably dressed guests, Claire Bennett moved through the crowd with a tray of drinks balanced in one hand and her eyes constantly scanning. At 27, she knew every corner of that room, every sidestep needed to avoid a spill, and every subtle expression that meant someone was about to ask for something. She had worked there for almost 4 years, and that night she was covering for a co-worker who had fallen sick at the last minute. She wasn't scheduled, but came in anyway. She needed the extra money. Moving table to table with practiced grace and a faint smile, she paused near one of the large windows where a man stood, discreetly blocking the path. The dark suit, squared shoulders, and silver-streaked hair caught her attention. He wasn't searching for anything. He stood still, as if waiting for something he couldn't quite name. "Excuse me, sir, you can't stand here," she said politely, careful not to tip the tray. The man took a few seconds to pull himself out of his thoughts and turned toward her. His deep brown eyes were shadowed by faint circles, a quiet weariness that didn't match the festive atmosphere. "I'm sorry, I didn't notice." His voice was low, deliberate, with an accent that hinted at years spent abroad. Claire gave a professional smile and continued on, tray balanced, but felt his gaze follow her as she crossed the room. It wasn't like the usual stares she'd grown used to, especially at upscale events. That man didn't look at her with desire or curiosity. It was more like he was trying to remember something or someone. When she passed him again a few minutes later, he was still standing there, alone, unmoving, unbothered by the buzz of conversations around him. He only stepped away when a younger doctor came up, greeting him with admiration. "Dr. Jonathan Reed, it's truly an honor to have you here." She overheard the name as she walked by, and suddenly it all made sense. Jonathan Reed wasn't just another guest. He was the most well-known neurologist in the country, a widower for the past 3 years, heir to a prestigious medical legacy, and current director of one of the top private hospitals in the US. It was rare to see him at events like this. He had withdrawn from the spotlight since losing his wife, refusing interviews and avoiding public appearances. Just being there was noteworthy. Claire kept her composure and pretended not to have heard anything. She kept working, clearing empty glasses and dodging guests, but his name stayed in her mind. Reed. She'd seen his face in magazines, on TV specials, and even in a documentary about cutting-edge surgeries. But in person, he seemed different, less untouchable, less distant, more human. There was something about him that unsettled her. Maybe it was the way he looked at the world, like it had lost its meaning. Or maybe it was the fact that, surrounded by hundreds of people, he still looked completely alone. Dinner was served in stages: appetizer, entree, dessert. Claire worked her way from table to table without rest. When it came time to clear the final plates, she had to pass once again through the VIP section, where the most important names of the evening were seated. Jonathan sat at the center table, flanked by international investors and local politicians. He didn't eat. He didn't speak. Occasionally he nodded, offering a faint smile that never reached his eyes. Claire cleared the empty plates from the adjacent table, and as she approached his, noticed his silverware hadn't been touched. The dessert sat on the plate, untouched, and his eyes, once again, were on her. Steady, patient. She approached. With her usual neutrality, said nothing, and began collecting the dishes. Just as she turned to leave, his voice stopped her. "Have you worked here long?" Caught off guard, she paused, tray still in hand. "Almost 4 years," she replied. "Why?" He studied her for a second before answering. "You move with precision, like someone who's figured this place out." She didn't know what to say. She simply offered a small smile and got back to work. But inside, her heart was racing in a way she couldn't explain. The event wound down around 2 in the morning. Guests trickled out, leaving empty glasses, crumpled napkins, and stacks of dishes behind. Claire was one of the last to leave the ballroom, exhausted, her feet aching, and her uniform shirt clinging to her back from the trapped heat. She made her way toward the employee locker room, tuning out the clatter of cleanup around her. She was already loosening her hair tie when she heard steady footsteps behind her. She turned out of instinct. It was him, alone. No jacket, his tie loosened, sleeves rolled to the elbows. He stopped a few feet away. "Didn't mean to intrude," he said, voice calm as ever, "but it felt wrong not to thank you." She frowned slightly, unsure. "Thank me for what?" Jonathan gave a half smile, warmer than the others. "For reminding me that some people still make eye contact, even when everything else feels fake." He held out a card, not to touch, just to offer. "If you ever need anything, reach out." Then he walked away. No goodbyes, no glances back. The next morning, Claire's uniform was still draped over the chair in her bedroom, hastily folded, and her mind was still reeling from what had happened just hours earlier. It wasn't the first time a prominent guest had spoken to her, but something about the way Jonathan Reed had addressed her had left a strange mark. He was calm, direct, yet gentle. Every word seemed to carry weight. She'd tucked his business card into her wallet without inspecting it a second time. Not because she wasn't interested, but because she genuinely didn't know what to do with it. So, she did what she always did. Got up early, stopped by the bakery on the corner to pick up her usual bagel, dropped off groceries at her mother's apartment, and headed into work. The hotel was quieter that morning, with fewer scheduled events and a smaller staff on duty in the main dining area. Claire was assigned to the service bar, organizing glassware and running small orders from the kitchen, until one of the assistant managers approached with unexpected instructions. One of the suite guests had requested breakfast in his room and specifically asked for someone from the dining team to deliver it. Claire found the request odd, but didn't question it. At the Beaumont Plaza, special accommodations were routine, especially in the executive suites. She prepared the tray herself, arranging fresh fruit, warm croissants, brewed coffee, 2 types of juice, and the small bouquet of flowers required. By protocol, she rode the service elevator alone, hair pinned up, her face composed the way it always was when she needed to stay focused. When the elevator doors opened on the top floor, she was greeted by one of the hotel's security staff. He led her down the hallway to the suite and said simply, "He's expecting you." Claire took a steady breath, adjusted her posture, and knocked twice. The door opened partially, and for a moment she thought she might have the wrong room. But no, it was him. Jonathan Reed. No lab coat, no suit, no signs of the elegant detachment from the night before. Just a light cotton shirt and a face that looked recently shaved. He appeared younger, more approachable. And yet, he still gave Claire that subtle, inexplicable sense of being seen far beyond her uniform. "Good morning. Did you request the breakfast service?" she asked, maintaining a formal tone. Jonathan gave a small nod and stepped aside, motioning to the table by the window. The suite was spacious, decorated in neutral tones, with large windows overlooking the city skyline. She walked over to the table, set the items down carefully, and confirmed, "Everything is here as requested. Would you like anything else?" He stayed quiet for a few seconds, then moved toward the table, though he didn't sit. Instead, he leaned against the chair across from hers. "I didn't know it would be you." The comment made her lift her eyes. "I'm sorry, sir. I can call someone else if you'd prefer." But he shook his head. "No, I just wasn't expecting it. Maybe it's fate." Claire didn't answer. She had no idea what to say to a comment like that coming from a man like him. She remained standing, hands clasped in front of her, ready to leave. "Do you have the rest of the day off after your shift?" he asked, his tone quiet but deliberate. She furrowed her brow. "I do. Why?" Jonathan looked at her with a steady gaze. "Because I'd like to invite you for coffee. Somewhere else. Somewhere you can sit down." She didn't know what unsettled her more, the invitation itself, or the natural ease with which he made it. There was no innuendo, no implied promise, just a straightforward request. Claire paused for a second before answering, "I'm not sure that would be appropriate, sir." He seemed to consider her words for a moment before responding, simply, "Maybe not, but I don't see another way to say thank you." She looked away, took a breath, and said without moving, "I finish at 5. He nodded. "Write your number here. I'll send the address." She complied without another word and left. As she rode the elevator down, her heartbeat picked up in a way she couldn't control. It wasn't normal. It wasn't allowed. It wasn't part of any hotel protocol. And yet, there was something about his presence that didn't follow logic. Back in the locker room, as she removed her apron and pinned her hair back up, Claire stared at her reflection for a moment longer than usual. She looked the same face, same skin, same under-eye shadows, but something about the way he looked at her had felt real. The day dragged. Every customer request felt longer, every tray heavier. She worked at her usual pace, but her mind wasn't where her hands were. When the clock hit 5, Claire exited through the back entrance of the hotel with her purse slung over one shoulder and her eyes on her phone. The message came at exactly 5:01 p.m. It was brief. Just an address and the name of a cafe on the Upper East Side. No extra words, no questions, just the location. She thought about not going. She thought about deleting the message, heading in the opposite direction, pretending there had never been an invitation, but somehow her body kept moving forward. She took the subway to the closest station, walked 3 blocks, and stopped in front of a small cafe with a beige facade, dark awning, and lavender plants in the windows. He was already there. Sitting at the table in the back, a book open. In front of him, a cup of coffee, half finished. When he saw her, he stood. He didn't say anything right away, just pulled out the chair across from him. And in that simple gesture, something began. Something neither of them could put into words. They didn't talk much at first. She asked about the book. He answered with a short line. Then he asked where she lived, and she explained she lived with her mother in a small apartment not far from the subway. The conversation wandered through light, ordinary topics until the waiter came to clear their plates. Claire had eaten everything without realizing it. The coffee was good, but it wasn't the taste that stood out. It was the contrast, the quiet cafe and the man sitting across from her. Jonathan didn't try to dominate the space. He didn't ask intrusive questions or seem out of place for sitting with someone like her. He simply listened, responded when needed, and watched her without judgment. When they stood to leave, he walked her to the door, but didn't touch her. Just asked, "Can I see you again?" She took a few seconds before replying, then said, "You can," and turned to walk away, her steps sure and steady without looking back. But inside, everything felt different. Something new had started, something impossible to ignore. 2 days had passed since the cafe, and Claire still found herself replaying Jonathan's gestures in her mind, like someone trying to read between the lines of subtle cues. She turned down his second invitation the morning after, saying she had a double shift, which was true, but also a way to buy herself time. She didn't fully understand what she was feeling. She'd enjoyed their conversation, his calm gaze, the way he listened without rushing, without correcting. But something still made her uneasy, not about him, but about the idea of being noticed, perhaps judged. At the hotel, nothing had changed. She continued receiving instructions from her supervisor, carrying trays, handling room service, dealing with guests who complained about pillows or lukewarm coffee. Routine had taken over again, and she tried hard to stay focused. Deep down, though, she knew the distance she was trying to keep wouldn't last long, and that certainty solidified the moment she received a small box of chocolates from the maid. And at the end of her shift, he didn't say much, just that it had been dropped off at the front desk with very specific instructions delivered directly to Claire. Tied to the ribbon was a card in clean, deliberate handwriting. Not on the menu, but I thought you might like these. Jonathan. The packaging was modest, the note elegant. Nothing flashy to attract attention, but deeply personal to the one receiving it. Claire slipped the card into her pocket and stepped outside for her break, a small smile playing on her lips. She didn't respond right away. She didn't want to come off as impulsive, but later that same afternoon, after changing out of her uniform, she texted, "I'm off tonight. If you'd still like to talk, I'll be at Café Margot at 6. It was a quiet place, with iron chairs set outside, porcelain cups with stained rims, and the smell of strong coffee mingling with fresh croissants. Jonathan replied quickly, "I'll be there." Claire arrived a few minutes early, chose the corner seat by the window, and ordered a café crème and a chocolate croissant. The owner, an older gentleman who knew her by name, brought her order without a word. In a city where watchful eyes seemed to be everywhere, this little café in her neighborhood felt like a rare pocket of invisibility. Jonathan showed up right on time, wearing the same understated clothes, and that gaze of his that seemed to cut through layers. He gave her a small nod, took the seat across from her, and asked for a black coffee. They didn't talk much at first. He mentioned having come straight from a tense hospital meeting, briefly touched on a new regenerative neurology project, then let the silence settle between them. Claire didn't mind. She appreciated the lack of pressure, the comfort of not having to fill every moment with words. "Do you know why I asked them to send someone like you that day?" he said after a while. Claire looked up. "The manager assigned me because someone else called out." Jonathan leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on the table, and spoke, like he was thinking aloud. "I only asked for someone discreet, someone who could move around without drawing attention. I didn't know who it would be, but when you walked in, I knew they'd gotten it right." She wasn't sure if that was meant as a compliment or a confession, but there was no edge to his voice, just that strange calm that always seemed to surround him. The conversation drifted toward other things. Movies they liked, places they'd been, childhood memories. Jonathan shared that he used to spend summers in Rhode Island, in a house with a backyard apple tree and the smell of fresh bread every morning. Claire said she grew up in Queens, between a noisy street market and a public school across the avenue. They laughed at small things, talked about how the weather changed without warning, the loud neighbors on Sunday nights. When the server cleared the table, Jonathan gently tapped the rim of her plate. "Can I walk you home?" he asked casually. Claire shook her head. "I live close. I'll walk." He didn't insist, just got up, paid at the counter, and joined her outside. They walked 1 block together, and just before she turned the corner, he said, "I like this." She tilted her head slightly, unsure if he meant the food, the conversation, or her. Maybe all three. She returned home with steady steps, but a heart that couldn't keep its usual pace. The next day at the hotel was slower. Claire was assigned to help prepare rooms on the 6th floor. She spent the morning changing linens, checking towels, restocking the mini-fridges. By afternoon, she was sent home early. She used the time to visit her mother and drop off groceries. They didn't talk much as usual, but there was a lightness in her mother's tone that didn't go unnoticed. When Claire returned to her room that evening, she found a new message waiting on her phone. This time, there was no invitation, just A simple line, "I enjoy talking to you." She didn't reply, but she stared at the screen as if listening to a song she didn't know the words to. The kind of feeling that creeps in slowly. It was no longer just curiosity, it was a desire to see him again, and even if she wouldn't say it out loud, he had already begun to occupy her thoughts in ways that were hard to ignore. There were no plans, no guarantees, but something had been planted, quietly, unmistakably, and she knew deep down she couldn't go back to how she felt before that first coffee. Claire had been called in the night before to cover a shift for a co-worker who cancelled last minute. That's why she showed up early at the Manhattan Grand on a Sunday, usually her day off. The sky had woken up grey, with a chilly breeze moving through the hotel's long hallways. Things were quieter than usual, and she was assigned to the breakfast lounge, where she refilled trays, wiped tables, and made sure the more demanding guests got what they wanted quickly. She wore the usual uniform, hair pulled back, her expression focused, but something inside her had shifted. Ever since her last meeting with Jonathan, something had been stirring beneath the surface. It wasn't quite love or certainty, but his presence lingered in her thoughts, stubborn and constant. She tried to stay focused on work, but in between, serving coffee and clearing plates, she kept replaying the short phrases, the easy silences, and the way he looked at her, without rushing, without pressure. Around noon, as her shift ended, she found a new message on her phone. It was direct and simple. "There's a vintage book fair today. Want to come with me? Signed only. Jonathan." She read the message, slipped the phone into her bag, and kept folding laundry on her bed in the break room. After changing out of her uniform, she walked toward the subway, thinking over whether she should go. It wasn't how she usually spent Sundays. She typically stayed with her mother, handled bills, caught up on laundry, but there was something about that invitation, easy, unintrusive, as if he already knew that hesitation was part of her answer. She got off downtown near a plaza where the book fair was set up, with booths arranged in a half-circle, wooden, crates full of old volumes and handwritten signs marking prices. Jonathan stood by a table labeled Foreign Literature, flipping through a hardcover book, wearing a dark coat that contrasted with the laid-back scene. When he saw her, he smiled softly and lifted the book. "This one's rare, but I doubt. It has a happy ending." She stepped closer, arms crossed, and replied, "Sometimes the middle is what matters most." He watched her for a moment before setting the book back down. They strolled together through the rows of vendors, commenting on old titles, authors she remembered from high school and he recalled from memory. They paused at a makeshift coffee cart where the vendor poured strong black coffee into small glass cups, no sugar added, just like it was done in that neighborhood. Claire grabbed a palmier too, and they sat on a stone bench under a tree. Like before, their conversation didn't follow a script. Jonathan told short stories about medical conferences in small towns and patients who'd taught him more than textbooks ever could. Claire didn't talk as much, but she listened closely, sometimes interrupting with questions that caught him off guard. "Why did you choose neurology?" she asked at one point. He paused for a few seconds before answering. "Because it's the one field where answers are never final. The brain still holds mysteries, and I've never been good with easy truths." She didn't respond, just smiled and sipped the last of her coffee. It was the closest she'd ever come to true intimacy, and yet it felt so quiet, so unforced. It was almost strange to believe it was happening right there, between folding tables and cracked sidewalks. By late afternoon, Jonathan walked her to the subway station. He didn't offer to follow her all the way home, just walked beside her until the stairs. Claire stopped on the top step and turned to him. "Thanks for the invite." He gave a small smile. "It was better than I expected." There was no kiss, no promises, just a long look before she stepped down and disappeared into the crowd. When she got home, her mother was in the kitchen making vegetable soup and casually noted that Claire looked lighter. Claire didn't explain. She just said she'd spent the afternoon at the book fair, which was true. After a hot shower, she put on a loose t-shirt and scrolled through her phone slowly. No new messages, but she hadn't expected one. What had passed between them didn't need immediacy. It was unfolding like a book read slowly, each page turned with care. And for the first time in a long while, Claire didn't feel like she had to rush. On Monday, the weather was unpredictable, with on and off drizzle and traffic more sluggish than usual. Claire arrived at the hotel early, stored her bag in the locker room, and stopped by the pantry for a quick coffee before heading upstairs. The floor supervisor informed the staff that there would be an inspection that day, so everyone was required to wear full uniform, fresh aprons and closed-toe shoes. Claire didn't complain. She followed rules with ease, never needing reminders. Mid-morning, while helping a foreign couple find local cultural tours, she spotted Jonathan crossing the main lobby. He didn't glance her way. He looked like he was there on business, walking with a group of older men and holding a dark leather portfolio under one arm. Claire kept her attention on the guests, but a tightness gripped her stomach. It was just a reflex, as if her body remembered something her mind tried to set aside, that something was happening between them, even if it remained invisible in that space. Hours later, after her shift ended, Claire grabbed her things and found a brown envelope. Inside her locker, her name handwritten on the front. She opened it carefully. Inside was an old edition of a French novel, its pages yellowed, with a dedication on the first page. For someone who knows how to listen, even when nothing is said. Jonathan Reed. She sat on the wooden bench by the lockers and ran, her fingers over the book's worn cover. She didn't smile right away, but she held the book with both hands like someone receiving more than a gift. It was the second time he'd found a way to reach her without stepping out of line. No pressure, no invasion, just presence. And that to her meant more than any grand gesture. She left the hotel with the book in her bag and a quiet certainty. Building inside her, something was unfolding. It didn't need explanations, but it did require courage. Tuesday began with clear skies and a milder breeze than the past few days. Claire woke to the scent of coffee brewing in the kitchen and the soft whistle of the kettle heating over the flame. Her mother was already up, as always, tidying the counter and listening to a local radio station reporting on the morning news. Claire got out of bed slowly, tied her hair into a loose bun, and stepped into the kitchen just to grab a cup before heading into the shower. They barely exchanged words. Their mornings had long followed a quiet rhythm, one of shared presence more than conversation. After getting dressed, Claire returned to the kitchen and had a slice of toast with raspberry jam and a warm café au lait. Her mother had left everything out on the table, the jam, a small jar of honey, and a plate with the last piece of croissant from the day before. She commented on the weather, mentioned a leak from the upstairs apartment, and asked if Claire would be home late. Claire said she wasn't sure yet. That was enough. She slung her bag over her shoulder and caught the subway downtown, arriving at the hotel ahead of her shift as usual. She liked those extra minutes to adjust her uniform and avoid any rush. When she reached the locker room, there was a note posted on the staff board. Part of the team would attend a training session that afternoon. The rest, including Claire, had a partial day off. At 4 p.m., the supervisor confirmed she could clock out early. The sun was still bright when she passed the front desk and stepped outside. She walked a few blocks with no destination, taking her time. She stopped in front of a small bookstore with a display window filled with titles by contemporary American and international authors, and stepped in. She ran her fingers along the book spines, flipped through a few pages here and there, but didn't buy anything. She just wanted to stretch the afternoon, savor that rare break from routine. Just as she was about to leave, a notification lit up on her phone. It was a message from Jonathan. He said he'd be in a clinical committee until 6, but free afterward. He asked if she'd be available for dinner. Simple. No fuss. She replied, with a short confirmation, and waited for the details. A few minutes later, he suggested a quiet restaurant near the Gowanus Canal, known for its straightforward dishes and relaxed atmosphere. Claire headed back home, showered, changed clothes, and told her mother she wouldn't be home for dinner. Her mother looked up briefly but didn't ask with whom. She simply said she'd leave a slice of pie in the fridge. The restaurant had a dark wooden front and cozy tables set against the windows. Claire arrived on time. Jonathan was already there, seated by the wall, sleeves rolled neatly above the wrists, reading glasses resting on a closed menu. When she approached, he stood up, pulled out her chair effortlessly and said, "Thanks for coming." They sat down and placed their order without hurrying. She picked a potato gratin with a side salad, and he went for bœuf bourguignon with a glass of red wine. Their conversation was unrushed. They talked about the place, the weather, and an art exhibit he had seen the week before. At some point, Claire mentioned the leak in her building, and he offered the name of a plumber he trusted. It could have been the kind of talk shared between co-workers or neighbors, but something in the way they looked at each other added a deeper layer. It wasn't tension, nor was it anticipation. It was a complete kind of presence. In that modest dinner, every small gesture seemed to carry more weight than any confession. After the meal, they walked along the canal. The streetlights shimmered on the water, and the smell of bread from a nearby bakery drifted in the cooling night air. Claire paused briefly to watch a couple with a toddler in a stroller pass by. Jonathan stayed at her side, quiet. When she resumed walking, he did too. A few blocks later, he spoke softly, more like a passing thought than a statement. "It's been a while since I've had dinner with someone and actually felt at ease." Claire heard him but didn't respond. She just glanced over and kept walking. When they reached the subway entrance, he didn't keep the same distance he had in past meetings. He touched her arm gently, as if gauging whether a closer connection was possible. It wasn't invasive, just a brief, grounded touch. She didn't pull away. She stood there for a moment before saying she needed to go. He nodded. She descended the steps, and when she turned back for a second, he was still standing there. She arrived home shortly after 9. Her mother was on the couch watching the evening news. Claire kicked off her shoes, walked into the kitchen, grabbed the pie her mom had saved, and ate in silence, despite not being hungry. She didn't mention the dinner, and her mother didn't ask. She washed the plate, dried her hands, and headed to her room. She lay down without turning on the light, her phone resting on the nightstand. She could feel it clearly. Whatever was building between them didn't need constant validation. It moved slowly, but the signs were strong enough to know it wasn't fleeting. She closed her eyes and let her body relax. Sleep came quickly and without interruption. When she woke briefly in the middle of the night, she was still wearing her going-out shirt, and the room had turned cold. She got up to shut the window, then returned to bed and pulled the blanket over her. She didn't think about tomorrow. She just let herself rest, the soft murmur of the city outside fading into the stillness of her darkened room. Wednesday started busier than usual. Early in the morning, an international delegation arrived at the Beaumont Plaza Hotel, and the entire service staff received updated instructions. Claire arrived at work and was handed a temporary badge granting access to the rooftop where one of the group's private meetings would take place. It wasn't an area she usually worked in, but that day she had been assigned to assist with drinks and restocking utensils. The rooftop had been closed to guests, with a structure set up specifically for the event. Claire moved among the tables, with quiet efficiency, serving coffee, clearing glasses, and replacing bottles of mineral water. Jonathan wasn't there, at least not during that part of the morning. She didn't scan the crowd for him. She knew that whenever he was present, he kept a low profile, and even though his name was often mentioned by attendees, his face remained absent. In the early afternoon, during her break, Claire sat on a side bench in the hotel's indoor garden, a place most staff didn't frequent. She removed her apron, loosened her bun slightly, and ate an apple she'd brought in her bag without checking her phone. The breeze filtered through the skylight slats, and the noise of the city felt muted from inside. The pause didn't last long. She had to return to help set up the cocktail hour scheduled later that day, with many of the same guests. As she re-entered the main area, she crossed paths with a front desk colleague carrying a tray of envelopes. The woman stopped and handed one to Claire. "Someone left this for you at the counter. It's sealed." Claire thanked her, but only opened it once she reached the service supply room, where extra glassware was stored. Inside was a ticket to a contemporary film screening, a one-night-only showing. The folded sheet carried just a handwritten note. "If you can make it, I'll be in row 5. Jonathan." Nothing else. She stared at the paper for a few moments before tucking it between the pages of her order pad. After her shift, she changed in the locker room and headed home. Her mother was preparing a simple dinner of onion and leek soup, the table already set for 2. Claire sat down, ate slowly, and only mentioned that the day had been full. Her mother didn't press. They talked about the electric bill, a neighbor who had slipped in the elevator, and a distant cousin who had written from upstate. After dinner, Claire went to her room, washed her face, tied her hair back, and stood for a while in front of the mirror. She pulled the movie ticket from her purse and read the note again. Around 8 o'clock, she left the house in a light jacket and walked to the cinema. The sky was clear and the streets alive with evening activity. Upon arrival, she handed the ticket at the entrance and found her way to row 5. He was already seated, hands resting on his legs, eyes on the blank screen ahead. Claire took the seat beside him and simply said, "Good evening," without turning directly toward him. Jonathan greeted her with the same quiet tone he always used. Neither of them tried to strike up a conversation before the film began. The lights dimmed and the theater fell into darkness. In the first minutes, the closeness between them was purely physical. The armrest between their seats offered a barrier, but not enough to ignore the awareness of breath, warmth, the subtle brush of a knee. At one point, Claire shifted slightly, and her shoulder touched his arm. She didn't move away. She didn't mention it. She kept watching the screen, focused, while he remained still. When the credits rolled and the lights came back on, they waited for the crowd to thin out before standing. They walked toward the exit in silence until he said, "Thanks for coming." She answered that the film was good. He smiled. It was the company that made it better. They walked together toward the subway, unhurried. Along the way, she asked why he had chosen that particular film. "I like stories that make you think," he said. Claire didn't reply. They walked to the corner, and he watched as she descended the steps into the station. The next morning, Claire woke before her alarm. The sun hadn't yet risen, and her room was still dark. She got up quietly, pulled on a sweatshirt from the closet, and went to the kitchen. Her mother had already brewed a pot of coffee and left it in a thermal carafe. Claire buttered a slice of bread and grabbed a small jar of jam from the cupboard. She ate slowly, standing as the city began to stir outside. She picked up her bag and left without making noise. On the way to the hotel, she was focused only on the day's schedule. She'd been assigned to the main restaurant, and it would likely be a busy morning. But just as she passed the front desk, the concierge called her name. He was holding a small rectangular box wrapped in craft paper with a string-tied card. He handed it to her without saying anything. Claire carried it to the break room and carefully unwrapped it. Inside was a book. Not a novel, but an old neuroscience manual, marked with pencil notes and folded corners. On the card, written in familiar handwriting, You don't have to read it all, but I thought you might like to understand a little more about what drives me. Jonathan. Claire closed the lid and tucked the box into her bag. Then she washed her hands and stepped back into the dining room, where the first guests of the day were already waiting. The invitation came by text late Thursday afternoon, just as Claire was leaving the hotel with sore shoulders and a dry throat. She had spent the entire day in the main restaurant, serving back-to-back groups with barely a pause in between. She was about to stash her phone in her bag when she noticed the notification. It was Jonathan. No meetings tonight. I made something simple for dinner. Come over if you'd like. No emojis, no added details. But the message included an address, as if he knew the invitation only made sense if the path was clear. Claire stood at the service exit for a few seconds, just taking it in. She had turned down bolder offers before, from men who were far less discreet, far less compelling, but this was different. There was time, there was intention, and there was space for it to happen without feeling rushed. She replied that she'd go home first, then come by. Once home, she showered, pinned her hair with more care than usual, and chose an outfit that was simple but made her feel comfortable. Before heading out, she told her mom she'd be having dinner elsewhere. Her mother didn't ask questions. She just wished her a nice evening. Jonathan lived in a beautiful pre-war building near the East River, a quiet street tucked just off the edge of Soho. The facade was pale stone with tall windows and an old wrought-iron gate. The apartment was on the 3rd floor and there was no elevator. Claire climbed the stairs slowly, counting each one while keeping her bag close to her side. When she reached the door, it was already slightly open. Jonathan appeared in the doorway with his shirt sleeves rolled and a dish towel slung over one shoulder. He offered a soft smile, relaxed and unforced. Perfect timing. The wine's open and dinner's almost ready. The scent drifting from the kitchen was warm and inviting, something light and herby, with the unmistakable aroma of fresh pasta. Claire stepped in, taking in the space. Dark wood furniture, shelves of books, a record player in the corner, and a small round table, set for two. She placed her bag on an armchair and followed him to the kitchen. Jonathan was stirring a sauce over low heat. I like cooking on days when I don't have to talk to anyone, he said, draining the pasta. But tonight, I don't mind talking. Claire leaned on the counter and offered a small smile. Then let's not waste it. Dinner was served, casually. Pen with mushroom and white wine sauce, a salad of fresh greens dressed in lemon and olive oil, and bread, naturally. They ate slowly, lifting glasses between stories, with soft music filling the spaces between words. She spoke about her mom, the quiet rhythms of home, the fear of making mistakes and being seen as someone out of place. He listened without interruption. Then he talked about his med school years, about long shifts, and the exhaustion that led him to leave frontline practice in favor of administration. I'm still a doctor. I just see fewer patients now and manage the ones who do. It's lonelier than it looks. Claire understood. She also knew the kind of solitude that comes with competence. When the meal was done, he reached for the plates, but she offered to help wash. You don't have to, he said, gathering the silverware. But thanks. When she followed him back to the kitchen, she stood a little too close. Without meaning to, or maybe meaning to more than she admitted, as he turned with a dish in hand, they found themselves only inches apart. She moved just close enough for him to take in the whole of her, and with one hand still damp from the sink, he gently touched the side of her face, as if checking whether the moment was real. Their lips met in a soft, unhurried kiss, not rushed, but definite, a kiss with no performance, but plenty of clarity, like something the past few days had been slowly building toward. After the first, there was another, slower, deeper. There Hands found each other more naturally, and their bodies adjusted with quiet recognition. Jonathan led her back to the living room, still holding her hand. They sat side by side on the couch, no need for words. He slipped an arm behind her back, and she rested her head on his shoulder. They stayed there for a while, trading quiet, kisses and shared smiles, as the sounds of the city night filtered in through the open windows, their conversations eventually drifting back in. By the time Claire stood up to leave, it was past 11. Jonathan walked her to the door, lightly holding her hand before opening it. "You're welcome here any time," he said, voice calm as always. She looked at him briefly, eyes still lowered, and simply replied, "I know." She walked down the stairs, slowly, fingers still tingling from the feel of his touch. When she got home, she took off her shoes in the hallway so she wouldn't wake her mother. In her room, she sat on the edge of the bed for a few minutes before lying down. There was no rush of adrenaline, no worry, just the quiet sense that her body had adjusted to a new reality, as naturally as if it had always been there. She fell asleep without changing clothes, her face still warm from his kisses. And she didn't wake once during the night. The next day would be ordinary, but something inside her no longer was. And not because someone had touched her skin, but because someone had made her want to be seen, fully, and without hesitation. The next day began early, just like the others. Claire woke to the smell of brewed coffee drifting in from the kitchen and the soft murmur of the TV playing at low volume. Her mother was already up, sipping her coffee while standing by the sink, cutting a piece of multigrain bread and glancing through the weekly store flyer. Claire entered the kitchen, still fastening her shoes, and reached for a mug without saying a word about the previous night. Her mother didn't ask either. She just offered a spoonful of apricot jam and mentioned the forecast calling for rain by late afternoon. Claire ate quietly and left without rushing, her hair pulled to the side and her bag feeling lighter than usual. When she arrived at the hotel, she was assigned to the events team, where she would help organize a conference launching a new public health initiative. The main ballroom had been in preparation since the night before, with simple flower arrangements and chairs set up in a wide semicircle. Claire kept busy arranging tables and organizing the guest packets, trying not to think too hard about anything, except what needed to be done, but her fingertips still carried the memory of his touch. By mid-morning, Jonathan showed up in the lobby flanked by two older men, likely colleagues from the department. He was in a dark suit, his hair combed back and his expression focused. Claire saw him from a distance only for a few seconds. They didn't exchange glances or words. She continued sorting printed materials and not long after was called to assist with the refreshment trays during the intermission. During that part of the day, all staff were expected to remain professional and discreet, and that's exactly what she did. The event wrapped up around 2 in the afternoon, and she was released for break. She found a spot on a bench in the side garden, holding a small goat cheese and sun-dried tomato sandwich wrapped in a napkin. She was halfway through it when she saw his shadow approach. Jonathan stopped in front of the bench, hands in the pockets of his coat, his gaze steady. "I won't stay. Just wanted to let you know I'm flying out early tomorrow. I'll be back in 2 days." She nodded slightly, not standing up. "Okay." He stepped a little closer. "Last night meant a lot to me." Claire looked up for a second, then replied, "It meant a lot to me, too." He gave a quiet smile and walked away. She finished her sandwich slowly, her head resting against the back of the bench. There was no disappointment, only the quiet recognition that she was now involved in something moving forward at its own pace, with no room for doubt. She returned to the ballroom, completed her shift, and headed home late in the afternoon. Her mother was out visiting a neighbor, and the apartment was still. Claire took the chance to enjoy a longer shower, washed her hair, and changed the bedsheets. She turned on the old radio by the window and spent the rest of the afternoon sorting small things, clothes, receipts, scattered papers, all of it calmly, with no rush. In the early evening, she went to the kitchen, made a simple plate of meat and vegetables, and ate with a book that had been gathering dust on the shelf for months. She went to bed early, her phone on the nightstand, but without expectation. She knew he wouldn't write that night, and she also knew he didn't have to. Jonathan didn't return until Sunday afternoon. He sent a short message asking if she would be home. Claire replied with a time. At 6, he rang the doorbell. Her mother opened the door to a man she'd never met, tall, neatly dressed, with a direct gaze. He didn't wait for her to ask. "Good evening. You must be Claire's mother." "I'm Jonathan Reed." His voice was calm, effortless. "She talks about you all the time." His tone was respectful, and he gave a subtle nod that didn't feel rehearsed. Her mother observed him for a moment, weighing her response, and then said, "Good evening, nice to meet you. She's in the kitchen." She stepped aside so he could enter, then disappeared back into the hallway without another word. Claire was in the kitchen, preparing tea. When he stepped in, she simply extended a hand toward the table. "It's not dinner, but the tea's ready." Her mother excused herself, saying she needed to run to the store before it closed. When the door shut behind her, the two of them sat down. Jonathan slipped off his coat and placed it on the back of the chair. The next few minutes were filled with a quick summary of his trip: a medical conference in Boston, 2 formal dinners, a visit to a hospital campus. Claire listened while pouring the tea. Then she shared her updates about the hotel, shift changes, co-workers. Time slowed with them at that little table, mismatched cups and the quiet clink of dessert spoons touching ceramic. The mood wasn't one of urgency, it was one of continuation. When he moved toward her, she didn't wait for the cue. She stood and hugged him tightly, resting her face against his chest for a few moments. Jonathan wrapped his arms around her waist and stayed there quietly. The kiss came soon after. No planning, just natural. Their lips met slowly, steadily, as if they no longer needed to ask permission. Then he leaned back, just enough to rest, his forehead against hers, and whispered, "I have to go." Claire nodded and walked him to the door. Before stepping out, he kissed her again, shorter this time, but still full of intent. The invitation came on a quiet night, while they were curled up on his living room couch with a light blanket over their legs and 2 half-full glasses of wine on the coffee table. They'd had dinner at home, laughed over a college memory Jonathan had just shared, and were watching an old movie she had never seen before. Claire was talking about the soundtrack when he said, as casually as if he were topping off her glass, "I was thinking we could spend the weekend in Newport. It's a beautiful, peaceful place. I know a small hotel there, right by the harbor." She looked at him for a moment. "Newport?" He nodded, his arm still resting behind her. "It's close. Just a couple of hours by car, if you can confirm. Your time off? We could leave Saturday morning and come back Sunday evening." She brought the glass to her lips, thought for a second, then said, "I am off this weekend, and I'd love to." He smiled, like someone confirming something he already felt certain about. No further plans were made that night, just the movie playing again, and their feet tangled beneath the blanket, as if the trip had already begun. They left New York at 8 on Saturday morning. Jonathan drove with one hand on the wheel and the other resting gently on her leg, while Claire cracked open the window to let in the crisp morning air. The radio played a mixed playlist of jazz and 70s soft rock, and the two of them commented on the changing scenery, small towns, tree-lined roads turning with autumn, and quiet stretches of countryside. They stopped once at a roadside bakery, sitting at a small table in the sun to share a slice of warm apple cinnamon pie. They reached Newport just before noon, The hotel was charming, with blue-painted window frames and the subtle scent of lavender drifting through the lobby. Their room overlooked the water, with white linens that seemed even brighter under the light pouring in from the balcony doors. Claire walked over to the window and said she couldn't remember the last time she'd been somewhere so peaceful. Jonathan stepped behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist, and rested his chin on her shoulder. They stood there quietly, for a moment, watching the boats tied up across the street. They spent the afternoon wandering through the cobblestone streets of downtown, stepping into local artisan shops, pausing in front of gallery windows, and taking pictures near colorful storefronts. They stopped for lunch at a small seafood restaurant where they shared a platter of grilled shellfish, roasted potatoes, and chilled white wine. Their conversation was light and easy, stories from work, quirky client moments, and inside jokes that made them laugh with their whole bodies. By the time they returned to the hotel, it was after 5. Claire sat on the edge of the bed, kicked off her shoes, and mentioned how good it felt to be tired after a day like that. Jonathan brought over 2 glasses and left the wine bottle on. "The dresser. We can go out later or just order something here," he said. She agreed. After a shower, she slipped into a light nightgown and sat on the edge of the bed towel, drying her hair. He watched her from across the room, still in his unbuttoned shirt, barefoot. When she turned to him, he walked over slowly, still holding his glass. The kiss came without a word. It was long, deliberate, and full of meaning. That night, they gave themselves to each other with both body and time. There were no rushed movements or unnecessary words, just lingering eye contact, careful touches, and a growing intimacy that felt both new and grounding. Claire felt like they'd stepped into a space that hadn't existed before, one made of gestures and connection that she hadn't known. Jonathan touched her with a mix of desire and patience, as if he knew how to wait but didn't want to anymore. When they woke up on Sunday, it was still early. She was lying on her side, hair loose over the pillow. He moved close, kissed her shoulder slowly, then rested his forehead against her back. They said nothing. Later they got up, showered together, and headed down to the breakfast room. They ate croissants, fresh fruit, and strong coffee in a quiet that wasn't awkward. It was a comfortable stillness, where everything important had already been said, and was still present in the way she touched his arm when asking for sugar, or the way he pulled her chair out for her without a word. On the drive back to New York, they talked about movies, work, and the Sunday farmers market she liked to visit. He mentioned an upcoming trip to Boston and asked if she'd want to join him. Claire chuckled. "Do you always travel this much?" He gave a soft smile. "Sometimes, but I'm starting to enjoy staying close to home a bit more." She didn't reply, but the look she gave him said enough, like she understood exactly what he was offering. When they pulled up in front of her building, he let the car idle and held her hand for a few moments before speaking. It felt good to get away for a bit. She nodded. It really did. He leaned over to kiss her, and she returned it with quiet warmth. As she reached for the door handle, she said, "I think I'll bring a book next time." He tilted his head toward her. "Bring 2, just in case you stay longer." She laughed, stepped out of the car, and closed the door gently. When she entered her building, he was still there, one arm resting on the steering wheel, a quiet smile still on his face. The weeks that followed brought changes neither of them had to speak out loud. Claire started spending more nights at Jonathan's apartment, first just on weekends, then also during the week, whenever their schedules lined up. The small overnight bag she used to bring sat in the corner for a while, then moved into the closet and eventually gave way to a drawer that was just hers. Their routine didn't change drastically, but the details started telling a different story. She made coffee while he shaved. He stopped by the farmer's market and left her favorite fruits on the counter. They had dinner together most nights. Sometimes, at home, sometimes at small neighborhood restaurants they'd discovered along the way. And when they weren't together, they exchanged short texts about their day. They didn't use pet names. They didn't call each other babe or honey, but the gestures said more than any label could. They were a couple, in practice, in rhythm, in the quiet affection that filled the shared spaces around them. They just hadn't told anyone yet. The first time they were seen together in public as a couple, Jonathan invited her to an art and medicine exhibit at a cultural center in Soho. The event brought together professionals from the medical field and artists exploring the human form. He was one of the guest speakers. Claire hesitated at first, saying it probably wasn't her scene, but he took her hand and said, "Your place is with me, and that's where I want you to be." She smiled and kissed him. She wore a navy blue dress with light fabric, pinned her hair up with a simple clip, and chose a pair of low heels she always wore when she needed to feel grounded. In the lobby, some people greeted her with vague smiles. Others didn't notice her at all. But when one of Jonathan's colleagues approached and asked who she was, he answered without pause, "Claire, my girlfriend." She smiled politely and looked at him with a quiet kind of warmth. They walked through the exhibit together, stopped to admire the artwork, and ended the night at a cafe, sharing a plate of cheese and a bottle of red wine between. Soft laughter. Back home, she kicked off her shoes and laid her dress gently over a chair. She felt light. She hadn't felt out of place or like she was pretending. It was as if that introduction had simply named something that already existed. Jonathan hugged her from behind as she brushed her teeth. She looked at him in the mirror and said, "You said my girlfriend so naturally, it almost caught me off guard." He kissed her cheek and replied, "That's what you are, Claire." That night, they slept wrapped in each other, feet touching beneath the covers. The next morning, he made coffee and left her mug on the table with a note written on a napkin. "Today's going to be a good day." Claire tucked the napkin into her purse as if it were a charm. She carried it with her to work, and when she returned, Jonathan was in the kitchen cooking dinner. The days continued that way, with changing shifts, quiet talks about the future, and more space in his apartment becoming hers. One afternoon, while they were rearranging the bookshelf, he said that life felt more balanced since she'd shown up. Then he chuckled and added, "I think the only thing missing now is making it official on paper." It was a cloudy Sunday, and they'd spent most of the day indoors. Claire baked a simple yogurt cake, while Jonathan read on the couch, barefoot and relaxed. The whole apartment carried the slow rhythm of a weekend with no demands. When the cake came out of the oven, she waved him over. They sat at the table with hot coffee and still warm slices. He buttered hers and said the smell reminded him of his childhood. They talked about their mothers, about family recipes, about the little things they each remembered from growing up. At one point, she got up to grab a dish towel and said, almost as a joke, "You should just give me a whole cabinet." She didn't laugh, though. When she turned around, he was already standing near the chair, waiting. "I'm really glad you said that," he told her, still holding the towel. "I've been thinking about something for a while, and I hadn't said it yet. Would you want to move in with me?" His voice was steady, but there was softness in his eyes. She paused for a second, maybe two, before answering. "Are you serious?" He stepped closer, rested his hands on her shoulders. "I want you here. I want to wake up with you every day, make breakfast together, argue over bathroom space if we have to." She looked around the room, as if taking in the space, the timing, the offer. Then she met his eyes and said, "I want that too." And she smiled. They kissed, a long, quiet kiss, with one hand on her back and the scent of warm cake between them. A few weeks later, at a dinner with hospital colleagues, one of the doctors turned to Jonathan and said, "You seem more grounded lately." It was casual, just an offhand comment between sips of wine. Jonathan simply replied, "She has that effect." Claire was sitting beside him, chatting with another guest's wife, and overheard the exchange without interrupting. When they got home, she curled her feet up on the couch and asked for chamomile tea. He went to the kitchen, made it and brought it to her with a blanket. They sat close together, holding their mugs, not needing to say anything. It wasn't about beginnings anymore. It was about what comes after, about building tomorrow with the same care they gave to today. Claire rested her head on his shoulder and closed her eyes. A soft song played on the radio, filling the room gently. It was there, in that quiet closeness, that she felt at peace and deeply loved. The end. Did you enjoy this story? Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let us know where you're watching from. See you next time.